And now it's recording. Okay. Good evening, my friends, and welcome to the first ever podcast, The Moral Economy. I'm your host, Eddie Giuseppe.
I'm your other host, Fırat Nar.
And I am your other host, Andrew Fassett.
As this is our first ever podcast, it would be a good idea to answer the question, what is the moral economy?
Besides now being a podcast, the moral economy is three things: a website, a way of life, and an organization.
For the first thing, the moral economy is a website located at www.mainstreamidea.com. That is www.mainstreamidea.com.
On this website, you'll find a portal to collaborative, interdisciplinary research, advocacy, and activism, as well as a collection of artwork, memes, and even poetry on the subjects of justice, democracy, equality, and economics.
The aim of this website is twofold. First, it is a tool for propaganda to advocate the creation of a more moral economy. And second, it is a tool for people from all walks of life and levels of education to come together and discuss just how we are to create a more moral economy.
When you go to the website, you will find the format confusing. Moral economicus, political culturalism, polyphilicon, mythicult. What the hell are those things?
And if you click on most of the links, they lead to nowhere. Why? I don't know.
But that's because we want to hear from you. This is a collaborative project, and the more people we have on board, the better.
So if you do want to write something with us, select a heading from one of the three categories:
Moral economicus,
political culturalism,
and polyphilicon mythicult, and start writing. You can send your ideas to moraleconomy@mainstreamidea.com.
That's moral economy
@mainstreamidea.com.
We accept drafts, proposals, and abstracts, and only one of us has to approve your work to be published. The catch is that we will work on the article too, asking for references, adding comments and suggestions, or plain reworking arguments.
Don't worry, that's the idea of collaborative writing. It's both peer-written and peer-reviewed.
And we will be keeping tabs on what topics you write about, so if we are ever writing something in your area, we'll drop you a line.
Fertig.
That's good, man.
I think that was good.
We're sick and tired of all your lies, your unwillingness to compromise. So we'll take it into our own hands. Educate ourselves and take a stand. We're gonna occupy your street, your house, your bank accounts, your everything, yes, everything. Oh, we're here to occupy.
I guess that's it about the website. Now Eddie and Fırat will take over.
As we said before, the moral economy is a way of life. That means it's a philosophy, especially a political, economic philosophy. But importantly, a moral philosophy. And as you will surely find out soon, as our name strongly suggests, we believe there is no such thing as morality without economics, and equally no such thing as an economics that is not at the same time intrinsically tied to answering moral questions.
Whatever you may understand under the concept of morality, we argue that any moral economy will be an economy that is for all of us, not merely for a select few, the bourgeoisie, the 1%, however you name them. Not only that, but the idea of an economy for all of us means that this economy must necessarily be based upon direct democratic principles. That is to say, the establishment of direct democratic institutions in the political realm, treating politicians not as ruling representatives of the people with their own power, but as trustees, caretakers, or custodians of our political economic system, whose job is not to decide what we do as communities, but to put into effect those decisions that a community makes through direct, deliberative, democratic decision making.
This is encapsulated in the idea that any vote for a politician or party in our current forms of representative democracy is essentially a vote against your own right to choose for yourself. The government, as we see it, should not have the power to choose for us. Rather, that power should be reserved for the people. And the government's role as a limited institution is to do exactly as the people say, with some accountable freedom to choose how to enact the policies of the people.
To put this in other words, we understand the people to be the experts of their own preferences, that is, their own wishes and desires, whereas the government as custodians should be experts on how to implement our chosen preferences. That means when people vote for custodians, they vote for doctors, nurses, and psychologists when the people decide on a healthcare system that keeps us healthy. They vote for physicists, biologists, and climatologists when the people decide to fight climate change and pollution. They vote for teachers, child psychologists, and parents when the people decide to create an educational system in which truly no child is left behind.
More than that, not only do we need to have more direct democracy in our politics, we need it in our workplaces. It is abundantly clear that without turning the means of production, what to produce, how to produce it, where it should be produced, as well as how the product is distributed and who gets the surplus, over to workers and communities, then no political system, however democratic, can succeed, and likewise, without a directly democratic political system, no, we won't be able to build democratic workplaces.
To elaborate, we will summarize the arguments put forth by Richard Wolff, an economist who acquired his PhD at Yale University and is currently a visiting professor in the graduate program in international affairs of the New School University, New York City. For more information on what we are about to present, you can go to rdwolff.com. That's wolf like the canine animal with 2 F's. His website, or democracyatwork.info, the website of his organization, Democracy at Work. To repeat, that is rdwolff.com and democracyatwork.info.
What Richard D. Wolff refers to as democracy at work is none other than the idea that firms, enterprises, non- and for-profit organizations should no longer be organized along hierarchical, top-down lines, but along bottom-up or horizontal lines. That is, the workers who work in a firm should come together, treat each other as equals, and democratically decide what to produce, how to produce it, where it should be produced, as well as how the product is distributed and who gets the surplus. This means, in short, the enterprises should no longer be organized along capitalist lines, but along socialist or communist lines. That's a socialist and communist in their true meanings of democratic economy, not their actually realized forms of state capitalism like in China and the former Soviet Union.
Wolff therefore advocates the forming of the WSDEs, worker self-directed enterprises, which he envisions as the practical institutional implementation of democratic economy around the means of production. That is what we produce, how we produce it, and how we go about distributing it. This is only a brief summary, and we encourage you to go visit Richard Wolff's websites as well as the Democracy at Work YouTube channel, where he discusses Marxian economics as they apply to our current events.
What we furthermore want to propose is that not only do we need worker self-directed enterprises in order to bring about a democratic economy, but also what we term democratic marketplaces. In a nutshell, these are, to quote from our website,
Quote,
public online institutions that put decision-making power into the hands of individuals and communities, so that individuals and communities have a direct, democratic means by which they can control which goods and services are produced or provided, how they are produced, who produces them, how much is produced, and at what cost.
end quote.
The idea behind democratic marketplaces is to put WSDs together with democratic crowdfunding tools so that the people who pay for products also get to have a say in what features these products have. To quote again from the website,
Quote,
butcher, bakers, and brewers, as well as device developers all across the world, provide their products on a more or less on-demand basis, meaning that while they benefit from the economies of scale that public and club goods could potentially provide, their one purchase per use nature means that they are sold as private goods. Yet what happens when a butcher sells expired meat, a baker sells maggoty bread, when the beer contains harmful chemicals besides alcohol, and when software crashes and wipes a person's
files.
files? Either a government agency has to step in, or, as in most scenarios where a product is bad but not harmful, users have to accept a corporate as-is policy.
Therefore, while these goods may be privately sold, a proof of purchase should nonetheless guarantee the user the same rights as the user of a club or a public good, including the right to get together with other users and have the product changed or make new products, as well as the right to punish the developers when they do not meet their promises. These rights should be self-evident, and we should not require a government agency that is subject to corruption and inefficiency problems of its own in order to punish bad and dishonest business practices.
End quote.
Combined with democratic marketplaces, Richard Wall's Worker Self-Directed Enterprises, or WSDs, become People's Self-Directed Enterprises, which we think is exactly in the spirit of his project. Instead of either relying on capitalist market mechanism or government agencies to serve our needs and protect our rights, we advocate none other than institutions in which we serve our own needs and protect our own rights. In other words, democratic institutions for a moral economy, which we term democratic economy.
Okay, so all of this has been to answer the question, what is the moral economy as a way of life? The final question is, what are we as an organization? The truth is, we don't see that we can separate the two, the organization from the way of life. A person is a sum of all three things, their actions, their words, and their thoughts. Therefore, we see that our thoughts should be put into words and action. Our words should be thought about and acted upon, and our actions should correspond to how we think to ourselves and talk to others.
That's why our goals are a mixture of thought, communication, and action. To quote the website,
Quote,
the moral economy is an interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, and transdisciplinary group of writers, researchers, artists, and activists. In very real terms, we wish to understand the underpinnings of our economic, political, and moral world, as well as to develop practical models for applying and living those understandings to, in other words, be the change we wish to see in the world. Our hope is that these models can be shared and improved upon and perpetuated in order to educate, enlighten, and emancipate human beings.
end quote.
Okay, so before everyone starts backing off, rolling their eyes and thinking, what a bunch of idealistic hippies, we want to say that the most important thing is that we start a conversation on how we go about building a more moral economy. We see conversation as the first step, since our words are a bridge between our individual, internal thoughts and our collective, external actions. And that is the purpose of this podcast. While in the beginning we will mostly be advocating our ideas, we hope in the future to conduct interviews, to answer audience questions, and to engage our audience and encourage them to start a real conversation.
I know we feel it's time we occupy. Hey, yeah, yeah. I reckon it's a revolution.
Recording?
Go, man.
Alright, so where were we? So, now that we've gone into who we are, we would like to devote the rest of this podcast to an issue that has been all over the media for the past 2 months. That is the current refugee crisis. For this, I'll hand things over to Firat and Andrew.
The first thing to mention is that the mainstream media refers to the refugee crisis as a European refugee crisis and not a Middle East refugee crisis or a global refugee crisis. As evidence of this, a Google search of European refugee crisis in quotation marks has 520,000 hits, whereas a Google search of Middle East refugee crisis has merely 22,000 hits. And global refugee crisis has 80,500 hits. I think it is important to point out that this is a very Eurocentric way of looking at the crisis.
And that's the problem. Of course, the refugee crisis has affected Europe. Hundreds of thousands of people fleeing violence in the Middle East are making their way into Europe, and European governments and people need to figure out what to do about this. According to Democracy Now!, the UN expects 850,000 people to cross the Mediterranean into Europe in 2015 and 2016, and already 366,000 people have arrived in Europe this year. And you just fucked it up, man. You just totally fucked it up, man.
That's part of the problem, isn't it?
Uh,
That all these refugees are coming in,
yeah,
and
Yeah.
the community is just not yet ready.
yeah.
But what we like,
Thanks,
the fact that we're
Alright.
coming out of Hamburg,
thanks Eddie.
is that Hamburg is mobilized.
Furthermore, as of August, approximately 2,500 people are believed to have died or gone missing trying to reach Europe so far this year, according to Democracy Now! Reporting from the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees.
Quote,
UN.
The latest figures available show that the number of refugees of concern to UNHCR in mid-2014 stood at 13 million refugees, up from a year earlier. A further 5.1 million registered refugees are looked after in some 60 camps in the Middle East by United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees in the Near East, which was set up in 1949 to care for displaced Palestinians. The refugees of concern to UNHCR are spread around the world, with half in Asia and some 28% in Africa. They live in widely varying conditions, from well-established camps and collective centers to makeshift shelters or living in the open. More than half of all refugees of concern to UNHCR live in urban areas. They all face three possible solutions: repatriation, local integration, or resettlement.
unquote.
The figures show that this is not a European crisis, but a global crisis. So why do Europeans, and with them the US, call this a European crisis? We see two reasons.
The first reason is that it serves to justify restricting the inflow of immigrants. If the politicians and media can control the conversation, and that conversation basically says 850,000, that's a European crisis. That's way too much.
Fuck yeah.
We Europeans can't handle that. Then it becomes easier for them to reject people at their borders.
True, 850,000 is a large number, but remember that 850,000 persons is only equivalent to 0.11% of the total European population. Let me repeat that. 0.11%. In political economic terms, that is a negligible number,
Hell yeah.
easily outweighed by the moral considerations. What is, after all, more important? That Europeans maintain their standard of living, that they do not have to share their streets, their buildings, their schools filled with people with darker skin and a different religion? Or is it more important to reach out and, heaven forbid, help their fellow human beings?
Heaven forbid. Of course, the former
Heaven
is
forbid.
more important
It is.
in the eyes of the politicians, the 1% and the media. After all, if we did the latter, it would raise questions of why don't we help people in our own countries.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, this question has already been raised, sadly, not by advocates for human rights, but by right-wing figures who are against taking in any refugees.
Shit.
We are not saying that this is what the 1% politicians and the media are thinking when they mention the European crisis. While I am sure that many are, the fact is that controlling the conversation like this serves their purposes, even if they are not aware of it. Remember that the 1% in Europe could single-handedly solve the crisis, give every single refugee a place to stay,
For real.
an education, a job, you name it, and
And
the
more.
1% will have more left over than they will know what to do with it. But if we did this for the refugees, then we would have to do it for all Europeans, and that's a slippery slope.
Bah, slippery slope humbug.
The second reason is, of course, that in many ways Europe and the United States have been culpable for the current global crisis. Politicians in the United States don't like to admit it, but if it hadn't been for the meddling for all of those years, the illegal wars, the drone strikes, the overthrow of democracies and the installment of dictators, giving corporate interests full rights over their resources and allowing them to plunder the lands, then we might not be in a crisis in the first place.
For real.
Europe has also sown a fair share of the seeds of chaos, and the cause of this crisis stems back to European colonial occupation
That's right.
of the Middle East and Africa.
Don't get me started, yo.
This is dangerous talk, and most people who mention this are labeled as terrorists.
For real.
But that's just childish. Look, Europe and the United States, seen as the inheritor of European culture and politics, is responsible for the current crisis. Of course, the Islamic State, Boko Haram, Al-Qaeda, and the oppressive regimes in the Middle East are also responsible.
Where did they come from?
But we need to take a historical perspective for how these groups and dictators came into power in the first place.
Preacher, brother.
And when we do this, it is undeniable that Europe and the United States are ultimately responsible. And if that's the case, maybe we need to stop involving ourselves in the Middle East and Africa, stop exploiting their resources and people, pay reparations, and start spreading democracy as we have always claimed to be our cause.
And we know that can't be the case. So instead, this becomes a European refugee crisis, caused by Middle Eastern and African refugees, not people, who are fleeing civil war and unrest in those countries over there, and not a global crisis in which we are all involved, in which we are all morally responsible.
Chicka chicka. And part
Heaven
two.
should notice, it's everyone, and we're coming for you. It can't be undone, won't be undone. We're gonna occupy your street, your house, your bank accounts, your everything, yes everything. Oh, we're here to occupy. I know it, feel it's right. It's time to occupy. I reckon it's a revolution.
Ready, guys?
Part three.
I'm good.
Now that that is out, we have just enough time for one more thing. What this thing is, I will leave up to Andrew and Eddie.
Of course, many people across Europe have indeed been stepping up to the plate, and whether through donations or through their labor, Europeans have been coming together to help the masses of people arriving every day. As we live in Hamburg, we will mention one way you can help here in our city.
You can donate or help with your time and labor at the Kleiderkammer in the Hamburg exhibition halls. They need most of all people to help sort things, but also cars, trucks, drivers, mechanics, and translators. That is the Kleiderkammer U2 Messehallen.
If you want to donate objects instead of time, the most important things are deodorant, razors, shaving gel, soap, shampoo, toothbrush, and toothpaste for adults and children, baby wipes, baby bottles, baby wound cream, female hygiene pads. What's baby wound cream? Towels, rags,
They have
and so
rules.
on and so on. A full list can be found in German on the website zusammenschmeißen.de. That's Z or Z, ZUSAMMENSCHMEISSEN.DE.
But before we get carried away with ourselves here, let's remember that charity, however frequent and generous, is not the solution.
It's also dangerous.
For real. While it's a tried phrase, charity treats the symptoms, not the cause of the disease itself. We need a systematic solution, not a reactionary one. On the other hand, we recognize the need to act here and now to alleviate the situation for people of the current crisis, as well as to look to the future in order to end such crises in the first place.
Now, you may be asking yourself, all right, Eddie, Farad, and Andrew, what can we do now to alleviate suffering and ensure this never happens again? Well, there is no guarantee that this will never happen again, at least so long as our current capitalist institutions are in place. So the solution would be to replace those capitalist institutions. That's why we are proposing a new approach to this crisis.
The first thing to consider is, why are people actually reluctant to help? Is it because most of us are selfish? Is it because most of us are racist and Islamophobes? Is it because most of us just don't care about dying children and families torn apart by violence and strife? We don't think so.
Instead, we understand that the root of the problem is economic. Not only economic in the sense that the cause of this crisis is economic in nature, since the roots of the crisis are found in Western economic colonization, but also in the sense that each and every person who is willing to help nonetheless makes a very rational and straightforward economic analysis. I can donate all of my time, energy, resources to helping as many people as I possibly can, and yet that will hardly do anything, if no one else helps. So why should I go beyond my own means when, ultimately, anything I do alone will not be enough?
But the point of the moral economy is that no person has to go beyond their means in order to participate. Sure, we could just go donate some clothes, cook them some food, or wire some money, but just as voting for a politician basically says, I don't want to decide for myself, donating to charity says, I don't want to actually help. That's because the real problem is not a lack of clothes, a lack of food, or a lack of money. The real problem is a lack of choice, a lack of opportunity, and a lack of autonomy for both the refugees and for us.
So the next time you wonder what you can do to help others out, we suggest you reframe the question. It should be, how can we help all of us? And when we ask that, the solutions cease to be individual, sporadic acts of measured heroism. The solutions become collaborative, deliberative, and above all, effective and long-lasting. They become, in other words, democratic economic solutions.
This isn't just rhetoric. Here are some practical things we can do. Got hungry people at camps? Don't hire caterers or drop off a bunch of food. Create a people's kitchen and invite refugees to help cook and, importantly, make decisions on what to cook and how to cook it. Many of the refugees were cooks themselves or know their ways around kitchens. Instead of giving money to for-profit catering companies, that money could be spent helping refugees feed themselves and gain an income while doing it, while also employing people in our own communities. Food and money donations would certainly be welcome, but let's cut out the middleman and form a people's self-directed kitchen together.
And then we can think, where do we get our food from? Food comes from somewhere, and all of our research indicates that food, in fact, grows on trees.
Yeah.
A growing proportion of our agricultural economy is dedicated to growing local, organic, fair trade goods. So let's start a people's self-directed farm. What's fairer, more organic, and more local than a farm run and operated by the very people who eat the food with their families and friends?
Good point.
Instead of giving money to for-profit farms, that money can be spent helping refugees feed themselves and gain an income while doing it, while also employing people in our communities.
What about medicine, clothing, hygienic care products, housing? Are there no nurses and doctors, tailors, chemists, or carpenters in the refugee camps? Instead of donating or finding them jobs as they work for us, let's all of us work together, refugees and locals included, to build an economy that actually responds to the underlying causes of the crisis and not just throwing token gestures at the symptoms until they're covered up again.
And before you say, hey, we can't all start factories and farms just like that. This kind of helping takes a lot of time and effort. We need to alleviate suffering right here and now. We will ask you, well, what's the problem? In the end, we need to integrate these people into our society anyway, and ultimately the only obstacle is us. True, this will take a lot of time and effort, but it will take much less time and effort to work together with ourselves and with the refugees than to rely on the individualistic logic of charity. It's the same analogy as give a man a fish, feed him for a day, but teach men and women to crew their own fishing boats, you'll feed them and their families for a lifetime.
Mainstream economists say we should help these refugees and migrants in general because we have an aging population and the refugees can pay into the system. The right-wing and neoclassical economists say we should not help these refugees because we should be focusing on the poor in our own land.
Oh, now you care about the poor?
We're saying we should help these refugees because it's the right thing to do, and because we have an aging population and poor people in our own cities and towns who have been forgotten by the system. We should help people in a way that helps all of us. The refugees shouldn't come here and receive our aid ultimately to work for us. Nor when they come here should they be seen as taking our jobs. Instead, we come together to build an economy around the situation at hand.
This is at the heart of democratic economics, and the reason we say economy is inseparable from morality. It doesn't have to start out as a mass movement to overhaul the economic system, overrun factories, and overthrow oppressive regimes, as good as that would be. It starts out with the question, how can we help all of us? From there you can make small groups of friends to organize, to share the burden of donation to charity, but also to go beyond charity. Small groups work together to become bigger groups, and bigger groups work together to become movements. And really, the only limit to what we can build is the number of people involved, which is just one more reason to include the refugees in the democratic decision-making processes and start people's self-directed enterprises to help put an end to this crisis.
Just one last point, if I may jump in. When we start asking ourselves, how can we help all of us? We remember that the refugees who arrive in Europe are by and large the wealthier members of the societies from which they came. The poorest members are still trapped back home, facing war, starvation, and oftentimes a lack of services because the doctors and engineers have already fled.
Don't forget that.
That is when they are not dying, of course. The individualistic charity approach of capitalism would have us help only those whom we see here and now, who affect us most readily. The democratic economic approach takes these people into account and points out that the system that created this crisis also leaves its poorest individuals to bear the brunt of its dire consequences.
Man, thanks for that. That's
Good
a very
one.
good thing to
Yeah,
say.
it is.
Alright guys, I think it's enough for today.
Yeah, okay, see you next time.
I'd like to thank once again Rhea and the Money for allowing us to use their wonderful song Occupy for our intro. I hope you enjoyed our first podcast, and hopefully until the next time.
Bye.
Tschüssi.
Their own livelihood.
What is democratic economics again?
It is what morality is. And
And I like-
morality is nothing more than that.
Yeah, and I think we should push for that kind of discussion. I mean, that's an interesting thesis there, right? That democratic economics is a moral thing, in which we talk about in our podcast.
I mean, that's the whole point of this is that we put out propaganda in order to get people to start thinking and be more involved with the ideas that we have.
And to highlight the fact that what has been already historically shown to be so-called communism is not in fact communism. It's state, as you mentioned, capitalism,
Yeah.
where the state controls the means of production. That is, how to produce, what to produce, when to produce it, what to do with the profits.
Yeah.
And what we're saying is that we have to distance ourselves from this state capitalism or neoliberal capitalism, where the wealthy have control of that, and say, no, we want actually democracy to be in the workplace. We consider democracy to be our highest principle. Okay, let's also put that in the workplace.
Yeah.
Logical, fair thing to do, and it aligns with morality.
Exactly. Capital is not just a thing, it's a social relation. It presumes, on the one hand, the owner of the money, and on the other hand, the worker, who is free in the double sense that he is rid of all his commodities, other than his only means of production, his own labor power. He has to commodify this himself. Commodification itself is a system-imposed necessity. It is not a choice. Commodity is the universe in which we integrate with each other.
Within this specific historical period.
Yeah, and let's not forget, that there's no such thing as morality in a vacuum. You're by itself. There's no morality. Morality is what's social between us. It's when I come to you, the other. That's when the moral relationship starts. That's where all relationships become moral, and that's why economics and then is inherently moral, because an economic relationship is a relationship. It's always between two people.
We could think also about, I think it's relevant to think about what Aristotle said about economics. I mean, the word economics comes from Aristotle's use of it. And for him, it was a relationship, a familiar relationship. The relationship at the home, at the household level, of how they kept their expenses. And the things that are involved with that. So maybe sometimes the sacrifices that are involved with that. But also in the basic interactions, right? The physical manifestations of our interactions with actual things that we use in our daily lives, and how that has to be handled. That is a relationship. That is a personal relationship. Automatically, morality is assumed with this. And the fact that we live in nowadays better than what it was in the past, but of course still a relationship that is in its very assumption, in its starting point, being a post-capitalist society, one of inferior and superior, automatically fairness is lost. And this question of morality has to be reinvigorated in our discourse about what economics is, to highlight that, whoa, it's unfair now and something has to change. And we see that something has to change, how horrible things are.
Exactly, this concept of change. I want to go back to the historical presuppositions that you mentioned, that it's very important, I think, also at our own historical consciousness. What do we have? The very idea that morality is a social relationship is so ubiquitous right now, because when Enlightenment started to be the common sense across Europe and then spread from there, it was based upon the separation of religion and morality. And this also was a simultaneous separation of morality from a thing to a social relation. This abstract separation necessarily took very concrete but particular and different forms in different places. But what is common to all of them is the separation of morality from an object to a social relationship. Yeah. Of course, there have been many rebellions throughout society. Class struggle is a historical fact. But the very consciousness in which we find our own class struggle in, that is something very specific that has to be defined on the very historical terms that we have been talking about.
Yeah, I have something to say about class struggle.
I've been waiting to get in.
But you want to go?
Now you both have mentioned something that I wanted to talk about. It was just you mentioned economics. Going back to the original meaning from Aristotle, it was the home. It was how you did the home, and then you mentioned religion. The separation of religion and morality, and nowadays we see economics as its own religion, basically. So
Yeah.
Exactly.
we're sitting
Yeah,
there. We're
that's
sitting
right.
there. We've forgotten complete, down to earth relationship
Yeah.
with your home or relationship with the people.
Yeah.
Part of economics, and we see it on now as this thing that encompasses
Yeah, and
encompasses all of us, and over which we have no power.
it overrides
I wanna-
all other types of moralities
Yeah.
that we might have had, that we still might have today. Religion, values that we see important, art, whatever. It overrides all of that, right?
I want to add to both of you that this comes in a fashion that is a very important lesson of psychoanalytics, as Zizek says. I don't know whether it comes from Freud or Lacan, but the concept of the return of the repressed. What Enlightenment has repressed became the very foundation on which it has come to found itself in contemporary times. The economics itself became the religion, as you said. But this was exactly what Enlightenment emerged as a reaction to. This was the concept that Enlightenment wanted to repress.
Right.
And now it's coming back.
But economics per se as the system or the personal...
As our ideology. We moved from religion to economics. Economics became our way of explaining things. That morality became a social relationship.
Yeah.
It was
Actually,
attached. It
you
was
know-
always embedded in stuff. We believed in things
Mm-hmm.
or ideas. But
Yeah.
right now it's all about social relationships. And this has dialectical consequences. It's not necessarily bad or right.
Right.
It's the way you
It's a
utilize
process.
this, as does economics, in the form in which it emerged as a reaction to.
You know, I actually want to put forward the thesis that economics has always been religion, or that they've always been intrinsically tied, and this is why also morality is intrinsically tied to economics.
But can I ask you a question, if you don't mind?
Yeah.
If economics is religion, I'm curious how you would define religion.
I want to explain it. It's like if we go back to societies, more primitive societies, you know, a lot of the way food would be distributed or things would be distributed, it would be like a shaman who gets to decide certain things, or a shaman who shares
Okay.
certain knowledge, you know, or shares the knowledge, you know, the morality of do unto others and stuff like that. These are all economic sort of way of talking with people. It's not just like don't kill people, but it's also, you know, give someone your bread, share your bread, share
Right.
your homes and stuff like that. And so it's always been intrinsically tied to religion, and now the economics of nowadays has become one of these monolithic religions, these
Mhm.
gigantic religions where again
You're
where
here.
it's detached from who you from the base, you know, things that you do every day. And just another piece of evidence. I mean, if you look at like Orthodox religions, you know, like Brahmanism or Orthodox Judaism, like they have very specific rules of cleanliness, of how you do things with food and stuff like that. And those are all, again, economic rules.
Mhm.
I mean,
They also narrow, with these rules, they also narrow the scope of their audience.
Yeah.
They're always tied to certain nations. But
Yeah.
then you have the next step is if you like, in the idea of religion itself, that it moves, it transcends itself, and it increases its audience in the form of economics. It becomes more easily accessible, but of course at different costs.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you made me think about it, but I wanted to briefly go back to, we went far. I wanted to go back all the way back to where I mentioned about Hamburg and the history of Hamburg and how there's this dialectic of class struggle, which is fascinating because it's still instantiating itself in our present day. I mean, we see its actions daily. I don't know if you heard a couple weeks ago, the Spiel Bodenplatz, one of the stages, was burned down. It was about 12
I
days
saw
ago.
that yesterday. Who burned
Yeah.
it down?
Well, no one knows. I haven't investigated on the streets. I'm on the streets often, I haven't asked around to see what's the story behind it. But from, I think it was the Zeit, reported maybe a week ago after the fire, that where the fire started wasn't a place where a fire ought to start. Therefore, there was an arsonist. And that's interesting because for St. Pauli, the Spiel Bodenplatz represents the encroachment of gentrification. I mean, it led to violent protests. I mean, I don't know if you guys remember December 2013, a group of anarchists. I coincidentally happened to be there when it happened. Attacked the
Coincidentally,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. No, I wasn't involved. I wasn't involved.
We were there together.
I wasn't involved, although But no.
My hand was broken.
Yeah, they attacked the David Watch because they closed down the beloved Esso station. The gas station, one of the busiest in Germany, that made a lot of money, but still wasn't enough for the developer who bought the area because they closed down the Esso
That's right. I used to
station.
go to that gas station when I lived in the Hafenstraße.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But also, it allowed the developer, because he got the building condemned because he didn't upkeep with the maintenance, of course, part of the plan, to kick out the people that lived there. It was an apartment complex above the Esso gas station. But also, this row of bars that faced the Reeperbahn, the Reeperbahn, they were closed down as well. And this was
Molotov.
really, the Molotov being the most popular one, the Molotov bar. But all the other bars, which were loved in St. Pauli, because these were bars that allowed young and up-and-coming bands to play there.
That's
Culture that
Yeah.
St. Pauli cherishes. I mean, it's the idea that in St. Pauli, as an up-and-coming band, you have the opportunity to be someone. Why? Because they have the example of the most selling band, male band in the history of our contemporary day, the Beatles. They had this space to perform, and they became this great band. And so Hamburg really, other smaller, up-and-coming bands came out of Hamburg. And because they closed this, anyways, they attacked the police station, right? And this has historical roots going down to the history of Hamburg and its beginnings. I mean, the history of Hamburg is one that it starts off as a place for elites to trade and not even pay taxes to the emperor himself. It was a free imperial city. And from the very beginning, we have this long history of the guilds, the working classes and their guilds, and what they were able to do. It's funny because in the Rat House, in the city hall, you have the statues, and this was part of the examples of propaganda, 19th century propaganda. You have the statues of the Kaisers, the emperors, all the ones that didn't impose taxes on Hamburg, of course. Above them, you have statues. Actually, above them you have shields of the different heads of cities, and above them you have statues of the different guilds in Hamburg. And so the idea was, this was built in 1897. The idea was that now the guilds, the working classes in Hamburg, have the possibility to vote, to have democratic control, so-called democratic control. They could elect their own citizens to be representatives in the Rat House. Why? Well, this was the case for the last 30 years. They only allowed this to happen by 1867. Before that, it was total control of about 25 to
When a
35.
good book got published in Hamburg.
Sorry?
When a very good book got published in Hamburg.
About that.
Yeah, in 1867.
Ah, yeah, that's right. Isn't that funny? Yeah, it's a funny coincidence. And anyways, before they
Just so everyone knows, that's capital by
Capital, yeah.
Karl Marx. I mean, before they keep on going.
Yeah, that's a good coincidence. I didn't realize that. And only these 25 to 35 so-called Grand Bürger families, the great citizen families, had control of Hamburg. This was a status during the Roman Empire that was given to people, to elites, that directly could speak with the emperor. These families have been in place here in Hamburg. They've been in power here in Hamburg for hundreds of years, at least 400 years. And we know actually some of them. We probably heard of one family's name. It's called the Warburg family. And of course, the Warburgs, the Warburgs, we pronounce it in English. I don't want to get into conspiracy theories because there's a lot of conspiracy theories that, use this figure to say, they control this and this. But if we look historically what some of their family members have done, it's pretty impressive in who they are. Most notably, one of the guys who created, was one of the main minds to create the Federal Reserve System, right? This is, of course, the conspirators. They take this and run with it. But it's interesting, Hamburg has one of the oldest banks in Europe. I actually have a student. I also teach English on the side. I have a student that he works for one of these oldest banks. It's called the what is it called? I have it on my phone. The Ruenberg Bank. And so to think about class struggle today and just in Hamburg is such a great example. I mean, we have this long history of elites and power and capital and wealth, and still it's very violent, aggressive form of working class resistance right here at the heart of capital. I think it's interesting. I'm interested to be in Hamburg at this very historical moment in
It's
time.
a good lesson to be here.
Yeah.
We have a nice opportunity, I think.
The accumulation of the capital, the concentration of capital, is not just the increase in wealth, but it's also a change in the very social relationship which produces it. That's why so much accumulation is always accompanied by heavy class struggle and conflicts. This was a time of really big transformation going on in Europe. The emergence of Vienna, for example, as a cultural hub, that came along with the class struggle going on there, the Austrian workers' class struggle. And the same process going on also in Germany, right? Right before Bismarck started to centralize capital and come up with what can be considered as the first form of welfare state in Europe.
As a way to tone down the heat he felt from below, from the working class.
That was already in itself a response to the economic crisis sweeping across Europe in 1870s. That produced Bismarck.
Yeah. What can you tell me about the German Revolution of 1914, was it?
1948, wasn't it?
It's the one going...
1914, I'm sorry.
During the First World War.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's also tragic how that ended.
Yeah.
Simultaneous mutinies on part of the soldiers fighting for the German Empire, and worker collectives declaring autonomy in their workplaces.
So 1919. I think it lasted.
Yeah, it's kind of strange how we've forgotten that as a society, right?
Yeah,
just how we've forgotten that the United States invaded Russia after the First World War.
Well, yeah, I think it was 11 countries or 9.
Let us remember, the first communist state in the world was found in 1917 in the Soviets around that time.
Yeah.
And the First World War, all these developments show you that it was indeed a class war across the globe.
And then Bolsheviks took it over in the end and turned it into state capitalists, which we call communism after that.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's an interesting short video by Chomsky about just the history of the word socialism, for example. And that's just an eye-opener to all these other systems that now we label as communism or this or that. And that's really a shame because, I mean, what communism is by words is way different than anything we saw historically.
No, we've come to full circle now, actually, onto the meaning of communism. That's how the conversation started. So I'm going to end it there. Bye, guys.